Good morning again. I have to share a story from memory because of the gospel readings and the readings today. A story I've told 1,000 times since it first happened. It was at the beginning of October on the Sunday when these were the readings, when I was an associate pastor at St. Victor in Calumet City. And given the scriptures, we decided to honor the many senior couples in the parish who had been married for not just a long time, but a long, long time. And so at each one of the Sunday liturgies, we had some chairs of honor up in the altar area. And at each Mass, 2 or 3 couples married a long time were at the altar sitting in special chairs. It was in October of 1978, which was the year that Pope John Paul visited Chicago and was in the United States. And so one of the couples, this dear, very elderly Italian couple, married 73 years. They were on my communion call list. It was in the days before we had ministers of communion, and so a priest went to a parish and you got the first communion sick call list of the priests that left, and you came. So I had the list. And Mary and Russell were on my list. And they lived, if you've ever driven into Chicago on the Bishop Ford Freeway, there's a big water tower in Calumet City that had a smiley face on it. You know where it's at. And at the base of that water tower was a cluster of apartment buildings. Each one had 8 apartments, I think. And Mary and Russell had a ground floor apartment in that cluster of apartment buildings. So I had gotten to know them, and they were invited to be one of the couples on the altar that day. And if you remember when the Pope visited, when John Paul visited places, and he had been on TV all week, it was the Sunday after he had been around in the United States, his ritual routine was he would preside at Mass, like down in Grant Park, and then he'd take the Mass vestments off and put a papal cape on and the big kind of sombrero hat, and then walk the platform where he had said Mass. And as he did that, since he was a European, he would give the greeting, which 2 hands gone together, and he acknowledged the crowd in that way. So we're at Mass. We introduced the couples that were there, and when I introduced Mary and Russell, I said, they've been married 73 years, and you could hear the gasp. Just like young couples going, what? And old couples going, what? And they all started to applaud. And Mary jumped up out of her seat and did the greeting, and only she was doing it like the champ. And she walked the length and breadth of the platform where the altars were, and she was taking accolades of a champion. Important, for me, that story was important because during my time in the seminary, we all had to do a pastoral project in order to get the degree. And my pastoral project had to do with the church's pastoral care of the divorced and remarried. Scene lifted right out of the scriptures today. And that experience, then we had to go out and present, and so the fellow that I was doing that project with went across the diocese to lots of parishes doing, back in the 70s, an adult ed night on pastoral care of the divorced and remarried. And what it was really about was to help people, particularly in that situation, to know that they were still part of the church, that they were cared about, and that they were entitled to the pastoral resources of the church. And in every place we went, I heard the stories of people like the characters in the gospel today, who told stories about how they were or were not pastorally cared for in the church. The most common one was everybody thought that getting a divorce kicked you out of the church, being divorced, when the reality for all of Christianity, a divorce in and of itself never had any effect on somebody's membership in the church. Never. There was never a time. So it wasn't like, oh, that's these guys out of Vatican II talking that new stuff. There was never a time when getting divorced affected anyone's relationship with the church. What did is if somebody had been married in a church ceremony, we all know this probably from catechism, but if somebody was married in the ways of the church, and then a marriage ended with the tragedy of divorce, and one of those persons were to marry again without the church saying it's okay for you to get married, without the church declaring nullity of that marriage, they couldn't. So they were considered now outside the church, and so weren't allowed to do things, not allowed to go to communion, all those kinds of things. And lots of us in the church find it easy to be self-righteous about somebody else's situation. Not always so much about our own situation, but about somebody else's. In every parish that I'll be ordained 50 years next summer, in all the parishes that I ever served in, there's kind of a thing that in the clergy circles we call it dibs on the new guy. A new priest comes on board and chunks of the parish play dibs on the new guy. And it's people who want to get his ear first to tell him who the good guys and bad guys are. Happens all the time. And often, the people that most enjoy playing dibs on the new guy tend to be more the people that don't necessarily roll up their sleeves and help scrub the floors and clean the place up and do ministries and all of that. So in every place that I ever went, there was always someone, and I won't say male or female or young or old, but you might be able to figure it out. There would always be somebody who, after was there for a while, they would often sit somewhere where they could keep their eye on the communion line, and then would come up after Mass and say, Father, I know you just got here and you don't know people too well, but you know that one in the pink sweater who came up and she had that purple ribbon in her hair? You know, she's not supposed to go to communion. She's divorced. They'd always whisper like that. We had a wonderful priest in our diocese, but a character. After he retired, he worked in several other parishes, kind of where I find myself now. But he was pastor at a place in Chicago, and that happened to him when he was there for a few months. And he said to the one who had told him who's not supposed to go to communion, he said, you know what? God knows that person a lot better than I do, and if God knows some reason why he shouldn't go to communion, let God stop him. And we were also taught, absolutely profoundly taught, that this spot right here is never the time, no matter what I know about anybody standing in front of me, that's never the time or the place to refuse communion to anyone. It's not a public show. It's not a public trial. It's not a condemnation. It's not a putting down of a sentence. There may be a conversation that could be helpful to have, but it's never had it here when we're in this posture. Always been that way. That's not what we all learned, and it's not what we all took away from our catechism lessons. What Jesus did in the gospel story that we heard today, it could sound like Well, sounds to me like he's condemning those people that get divorces. Sounds to me like he put them in their place. It's not what he ever did. He never put anybody in their place. Peter said to Peter, "Get out of my sight." Peter's one of the only guys in the gospel that Jesus ever tried to put in his place. Jesus said, "Well, what did you learn growing up? What did Moses teach you? What did you learn when you were kids?" We all know what we learned when we were kids, and so Jesus kind of did the same thing that the nuns did with me in the 1950s and what catechists do today. What did you learn when you were kids? And he said, "Well, Moses said we could do it." But notice a difference, a huge difference in the two readings today. Moses said a man could write a letter of divorce against his wife. It says nothing about what a woman had any right to do. Jesus said something different. If you're right, and he talked about what we'd call the divorce and remarried, it's adultery, all that kind of stuff. What they didn't teach us when we were kids, the reason why divorced people weren't allowed to take communion, had nothing to do with the theology of marriage. Nothing. It had to do with adultery is a mortal sin. If you got a mortal sin, you can't go to communion. Think about it. The church presumed that if two people were married in the ways of the church, that was a sacrament. Sign to the world of what God looks like and sounds like. That's what sacrament is. And if people set that aside with divorce or writing a letter of divorce, all the different ways that could happen, that the reason why a divorced and remarried Catholic could not receive communion was they were presumed, therefore, without an annulment, to be living in adultery, living in a marriage relationship with somebody that's not recognized as their spouse. What a huge difference. They didn't make that distinction when we were in 5th grade. But it was about adultery. And so we had a church that renewed its pastoral care of people in those situations that Jesus addressed in the gospel today. Because there were people that I know and you know, and maybe you, friends of mine, who lived in a relationship that by its externals could be called the sacrament of marriage, but who by what they experienced and we knew about their experience were in a relationship in which they suffered physically, emotionally, and spiritually for a period of time at the hands of a spouse. And finally were able to leave that relationship. And then with healing of their hearts and souls, find somebody who loved them and cared for them and with whom life was what we say the sacrament of marriage is. Look at them too. They look like each other. They look like God. They sound like God. That's what a sign to the world of God is. That's what a sacrament is. But the church would say you're living in adultery. And so the annulment process came. What people, again, didn't get told by the church, you're not nullifying your children. The biggest reason why people don't experience the pastoral care of the church after experiencing a divorce is they have kids. And they think that what we call church annulment would have the same impact that they think civil annulment has. Two different things. And so it's important. I don't mean to make this like a catechism class, but these scriptures give us an opportunity to say, do we all know what we're talking about? Do we all know how to be pastorally caring of anyone in our life who's experienced the tragedy and pain of divorce. I don't know anybody that jumps up and down over somebody's divorce, their own or somebody else's. Do we know how to pastorally care for, and tend, and heal somebody who's gone through the tragedy of divorce? Do we know how Jesus calls us to? And that's the point of today's gospel. Jesus would say the same thing to us today that he said to them 2,000 years ago, because what he always does is call us out of our status quo. He always says, yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I agree, and I know what you're saying, but all I want to do is stretch you a little bit. What Jesus always does is give us a little more wide-angle vision than we've had so far, looking at our own life or at somebody else's. What Jesus always does, he gave hearing back to people. He gives us ears to hear what people in our life are really saying when they tell their story or share their pain. In 50 years, I've met way too many Roman Catholics going through the tragedy of divorce, who, when they tell their story, describe how they were treated by a priest in confession, or what it was like to go to the rectory and try and tell their story and be told, you better not get a divorce, you're not allowed. And painfully, the number who were told, well, kiddo, you made your bed, sleep in it. That's not what Jesus would say. It's what the church often said too often, until we allowed ourselves to have our eyes opened and our ears opened, and to get more into what was a young person's kind of jargon thing a few years ago. And what would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? And so let's hold in our prayer today all who may be sitting in our midst today who have experienced the painful tragedy of needing to end a marriage. Of all those in any of our lives, there's nobody here who doesn't know somebody or love somebody who hasn't been through that awful experience. And too often we want to be like some of those priests in some of those rectories, and we want to judge and condemn. Things get said, I'm Southside Irish, a little German thrown in, and things that I would have heard said in that world about those folks. The line, did you ever hear the line? Oh, that one, I'm not surprised she got divorced. About some shirt-tail relative or close relative or that kind of thing. Jesus would say, don't ever let me hear you talk that way about anybody. Never. And don't ever try to justify being that way toward anybody, at least in his head. All he ever did was meet any person, us or anybody else. All he ever does is meet us right where we're at in the present moment, in the present circumstance of our life. And always say, what do you need? What can I do for you? I'll heal your heart. I'll heal your soul. All you got to do is just follow me. And to all the rest of us who can get self-righteous about other people, all we're supposed to do, the main thing, follow him. Pay attention to what he said. Listen to what he said. Watch what he did. And all he ever said, the main thing he said to any of the guys he knew then and any of us is, quit getting all discombobulated. Just follow me. Do what I do. Say what I say. And especially when you are with anybody with a broken heart, don't hit them over the head with anybody's rule book. With anybody who's got a broken heart, touch their heart with your words and with your deeds. One last story that kind of made the point. My older sister, who passed away a few months ago, went through a divorce just before her 25th wedding anniversary, many years ago. Her husband was like my brother. He was my cousin's best friend from the neighborhood and all of that. And my mother loved him like a son, like another son. And in typical ways of us Southside Irish, everybody wanted to get on the phone and bend her ear and talk about what a miserable no good that guy was, and on and on and on. And my mother, who last Wednesday she would have been 110 years old, she said to those folks, what went on between my daughter and her husband is none of your business, and it's none of my business. You're not welcome to bend my ear about him. I've loved him like a son for 25 years, and with whatever happened, I will continue to love him. But you're not welcome to speak ill of him in my home. She was well into her 80s by then, I think, or no, not even that. She was still working. Took her, takes us a long time to get to where Jesus invites us to be. So today in the Eucharist at this table, how about if we just give thanks for whatever he said or whatever he's done in each of our lives that's healed us and loved us.